I will tell you from people that have contacted me from YouTube that the messages are getting out there and we are reaching people who can't make it to church, and that's a good thing. But I do want to tell people that if you can, make it to church. Don't be someone who says, I can do this as well on my sofa as I can in a church pew. Because we lose something in that community, in that sharing and worship. And I think today's message is perhaps an uncomfortable one, depending on how you view it. The title of my message is, But If Not. And throughout the years, when I have conversations with people, some of the hardest conversations to have are with people who said, I prayed God would do this, and he didn't. I desired for someone to do this and that, to be saved, and they weren't. And they asked me, and they asked for reasons. Why did God not answer the prayer the way I asked? And I will tell you, I've heard a lot of good answers. And I've heard a lot of bad answers too. And sometimes those answers are not good because they're trying to tell you what God is doing. And sometimes we use too many flippant answers. One of the easiest one is when something doesn't go the way, well, that just wasn't God's will. And yet if I'm praying for someone's salvation, I know that God desires all people to be saved. Granted, people have their choice to either accept or reject him. But to say that it wasn't God's will is a little too quick, a little too easy. There are also people who will tell you, well, God let someone die to save them from pain that they would have had to experience if they'd lived on. And that's okay, I can see that. But what about the people who did not get saved from the pain, who live in constant struggle and trouble? The truth of it is, to try and answer those questions is a little bit futile, to give them the why, because I don't know the why. And I think in times, sometimes we as Christians do a disservice to God by trying to give somebody a why to a question we can't answer. There are questions that we just don't always know the answer. We're going to start our scripture lesson today in Daniel 3, 13 through 18. Now Daniel is in Babylon with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're serving an ungodly king in a pagan land. They have been taken away as youths, and they're frankly serving a very bad man. And the story picks up and it says, now Nebuchadnezzar was furious rage, commanded Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be brought. So they were brought, these men, before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar answered them and said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipes, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king and said, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your God or worship your golden image that you have set up. Those are powerful words for young people, and these are probably still teenage boys at this time, or very young adults. And like I said, they're serving a pagan king. They're in an unfair environment. And if I were them, I would already be asking God why. But as I've warned you in the earlier times, if you want to understand more of what God does, be in his Bible. And these men have been in the Bible, and they've seen where they understood that they were in Babylon for 70 years because of Israel's sin. So they already knew the why they were there. Why they were facing a fiery furnace? That's not so clear, other than that they've got a very tyrannical king. And I love the fact that when he wrote this, or when he spoke this to the king, he said, "My God can deliver me." He has no questions, no ambiguity about it. My God can. But then he added some words that I would not be as willing to offer. But if not, we still will not worship. The thing that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego understood was that God was more than capable of delivering them. But they did not presume to assume that that would be God's plan. And there's a danger in presuming to assume what God's plan is. And oftentimes we do that when we pray. We say, well, this is what should be the right outcome of this situation. We want to see healing. We want to see something change. We want God to do this. And so because this seems to be the right answer, God will surely answer it that way. Now there's a danger in that, because we put ourselves in the position of God when we do that. And I cannot tell you how many times I have been proven wrong in what I thought was the right course of action for God, only later to see that that would have been catastrophic had God picked my way instead of his. God is very clear that I'm not nearly as smart as I think I am. And the truth of it is, mankind constantly needs to be reminded of that. And God does that very well in Isaiah 55, verses 8 through 9. And he's speaking to the people. He says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." One of the realities of being a Christian is accepting that I ain't as smart as I think I am. And for those English teachers, they would have already said, yep, you used ain't, you ain't very smart. But the reality is, we as human beings think we have the best plan. We think that it's going to work out a certain way. And unfortunately, as I've lived my life as a Christian, more frequently than not, I've seen God take that plan that I had and throw it out the window and use a plan that was totally unknown from me. And it's hard to accept that. It's something about my nature that says, I want to have some say in this. I'm a bit of a control freak, I'll admit it. I like having plans. I like having a system that says, here's this step, here's the next step. And the truth of it is, God rarely gives us a roadmap of the steps that he's planning. And some of those steps are uncomfortable steps. When you're looking at the loss of a loved one, a serious illness, the salvation of a family member, those are things that we feel strongly God should respond to in the way we would desire. And yet he doesn't always. But take heart, he understands that problem of ours. Because his son, Jesus Christ, equally had that same problem. That desire that maybe God's plan isn't the best one. And we see it expressed in Luke 22, starting with verse 41 through 44. And Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night before he's crucified. And it says, he withdrew from them a stone's throw and knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And then there appeared to him an angel of heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. Jesus was looking at other plans. He would have preferred not to have died in that cross. But look at those words very clearly. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he was leaving room for the Father to put the ultimate say in what was going on. And I will tell you, if you're going to adopt that but if not attitude, it's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. Part of you is going to always want to hold out and say, I want to have a plan, Lord. I want to see, if you're not going to take my plan, I want to see how this plan of yours works out. And sometimes we get to see that, and sometimes we do not. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went into a fiery furnace not knowing whether God would deliver them or not. There was no assurance saying, don't sweat this, you're on your way in, and you will walk your way back out. And that takes a lot of faith. And I will tell you, it takes more faith than we often have, which requires us to grow in faith. It requires me to say, God, however this turns out, you have it, and I'm okay with that. If it means dying, I'm okay with that. If it means losing the loss of a loved one or child, I'm okay with that. Do I understand it? No, I don't. But I understand that you are God and I am not. And it is not something you will come by naturally. It is not something that you will do easily. You will struggle with this. I struggle with this. Everyone struggles with this because it's not part of our nature to say, whatever, God, you've got this. And to ask God and say, please deliver us, but if not, I'm okay with that also. It's interesting because so often when life goes on, we like to see fair. You know, how many times have you heard someone tell you that life is unfair? And I'm here to tell you, congratulations. I don't know how long that took you to figure out, but yes, life is unfair. In fact, I always like to joke that the fair comes to the state once a year in August, and it's in Des Moines. But it has nothing to do with your life. Fair is not part of a life experience. And yet, we as human beings want it to be fair. We want it to be level playing fields. We want to see one person be treated the same as everybody else, because that seems right. And yet life constantly, we witness unfair things. We see a child taken at birth with a disease that can't be cured. We see people killed in auto accidents that were just beautiful, wonderful people who gave so much of their lives and then were taken away in a moment. And we go, how unfair, how unjust. And it's easy in those times to say, well, no, wait a minute, God. I'm questioning you here. I'm not sure what that happened right there should have happened. I want to know why. And you know what? When you start to demand of God why, you will get reprimanded. And I want to give you an example of that because Peter was that way. In John 21, verses 21 and 22, Peter had just been told by Jesus how he was going to live in persecution and he was going to die a horrible death. Now, those are not the kind of words you're going to enjoy hearing. And after Peter's sitting here listening to say, wow, I'm going to have a lousy life, and then I'm going to die a very torturous death. And he looked at John. And John, by his own admission, says he was the one that Jesus loved. There was a fondness there. And Peter said in John 21, Peter saw him and said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? And Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. Now, Peter wanted fair. If I'm going to suffer, so should John. He should have to suffer just like I do. That would be fair, right? Because we're both disciples. And the truth of it is, if you look at the Bible, John is one of the only disciples that is not crucified and killed. He is placed on the island of Patmos. He is tortured. He does live a hard life, but he does die of natural causes. Some would argue that that's not fair, considering how the rest of the disciples died very torturous deaths. But that's what Jesus is pointing out. Life is not fair. Some people will suffer more than others. Life is not going to be easy, and if you believe it should be, you're living in a naive delusion. Because I do not believe that life is fair or easy. Now, the other part of that is that, like Peter, explain to me, Lord, why? Why does John get to live and I have to die? Now, that's an arrogant thing to say to God. Why does this child die at birth and this person live an evil, terrible life and live to be an old man? Why, Lord? Why? And the question should always be, why in the world do you ask such a question of God? I cannot see the world from God's perspective. I cannot explain. I cannot give you the why. And anyone who tries to will probably fail in trying. I'm hopelessly depressed by the number of times that I've heard people at a funeral going, well, this was God's will. This was God's will. And I don't know that I can honestly say that I feel that was God's will. There are tragedies in life. There's loss of life that I don't believe were God's will. But God allowed them. Why? Don't ask me. That's above my pay grade. I don't get paid high enough to be able to answer the why questions. And I'm not smart enough. And trust me, you don't have to know me very long to know that. I can't give you the whys. Only God can. It kind of reminds me of a story of a lady who was taking a flight on an airplane. And it was at night. And as she was sitting there watching out the plane's window, she noticed a blinking light on the edge of the wing. So she flagged the flight attendant over and says, excuse me, ma'am, but you need to tell the pilot that his left turn signal is still on. Now, you and I are a little bit like that when we ask God why. We don't understand why. That lady did not understand the meaning of what that light was there for. She didn't understand its purpose. She had no grasp as to understanding the why. You and I, when we ask God why, are very much like that lady. And those things that we have to realize and come to grips with is that I have to quit asking why more and being willing to say, but if not. I am not suggesting you should not pray. I'm not suggesting you should not pray and petition God, because that is exactly what the Bible tells us to do. But when I pray, be very cautious to make sure that the attitude or the words both are in that prayer. But if not, Lord, I'm okay. If I don't get what I request, I'm willing to trust you over me. Trusting God places me completely in His will. And just like Jesus, it's allowing Him to say, or allowing us to say, not my will, but yours. There are times where we will face uncertain things. We will see unfair things. We as Christians will witness terrible tragedies that the why escapes us. And I would have you hesitate when people ask you, well, why did God allow that? To be too quick to answer that question. Because I honestly can't do that, nor can you. We may not be able to see the why. We may not be able to deal with all at all. In fact, it may just completely go beyond our comprehension. But it does require me, if I do that, to trust God more. Just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I have to say, my God can deliver me, but if not, I'm okay with that also. You've heard a lot of Christians who went through a lot of hard times, and I've spoke about the Fox's Book of Martyrs before, and it's a wonderful book. It's a horrible book. Let me tell you, if you chose to read that book, understand it is unpleasant. The gruesome destruction of life in that book, of men and women who died for the cause of Christ, and none of them questioning why. It is hard to see God saying, this is okay, when we as human beings desire to say, no, that's not okay. That shouldn't happen. These are good people. These should not be treated this way. God should give them extra protection. And yet, if you read that Book of Martyrs, you see these men and women dying with an assurance and a faith that God is with them. You know, the beautiful thing about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is they went into a fiery furnace not knowing whether they were going to die or live. And if you read the book of Daniel further, you'll see where it says, and there appeared a fourth man in there. And most scholars will tell you that that fourth man was in fact Jesus Christ. Now imagine being thrown into a fiery furnace, not knowing whether you're about to live or die, and then you see Jesus. And I have to believe that those three men were sitting there perplexed and going, okay, are we still alive or are we dead and we're now in heaven? Because here's Jesus. And they got shook back by the fact that Nebuchadnezzar called them out of the furnace. And they're going, oh, I guess we're still alive then. And so it's interesting that even in that story, these poor men didn't know, and when we get to heaven, I just want to hear what they have to say as they saw Jesus appear in that furnace with them, and how long it took them to figure out they were still alive and not going into heaven. Because, let's face it, they were okay either way. If we die here, we're going to heaven. We're going to be with God. I've shared it at Bible studies several times. I've shared it here at the service. There's a story of an elderly missionary woman in Africa who was telling people about Jesus. And she went around, and there was a warlord in this area, and he was going out and cultivating young men to be in his army. And the problem was this elderly woman was telling these people about the love of Jesus. And these kids were responding to her rather than his call for warriors. So being a warlord, dealing as warlords do, he went and he confronted this missionary woman. And he says, you will either quit preaching Jesus or I will kill you right now. And the elderly woman smiled and patted the bag. And she goes, in this bag is my sari, which in Africa is a ceremonial dress. It's what she would be buried in. She goes, if you kill me today, I go to be with Jesus, and I will be blessed. If you do not kill me today, I'm going to return to that village and preach Jesus Christ to those people, for that too will bless me. You see, that woman could not be conquered, and that warlord went away frustrated because that woman said, but if not. And she was confident with either outcome because she knew the God she served. And she was not afraid of either of those outcomes. Now, I will tell you that when Nebuchadnezzar called those men out, he had a little bit of a problem. In fact, he had a bit of a crisis of faith. And once you will understand, and this is something that the atheists hate, because Nebuchadnezzar is a very well-known, documented man in history. No one disputes Nebuchadnezzar. As much as they wish to dispute the Bible, they will not dispute Nebuchadnezzar. But the 4th chapter of Daniel is written by none other than Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, after these men came out, Nebuchadnezzar made a rule. It says, you will all worship the God of Yahweh, those Jews. Because I just witnessed him in a fiery furnace. And he just delivered these men. And the fiery furnace, if you do not remember the story, the very men who threw these 3 men into the furnace perished because the furnace was so hot that the men that threw them in died. And yet they spent a considerable amount of time inside that furnace and were not even singed. In fact, there was not even the sense of smoke on their clothing. When you live a but if not life, you will tell people about the true faith in Jesus Christ that you have. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did that with Nebuchadnezzar. And I'll tell you the truth, it had an impact on Nebuchadnezzar. Now today, I live in a world where many in the church and society as a whole tell me that all my prayers and wish lists should be answered. There is a movement that is laughable called the Name It and Claim It Club, which says, if I go to God and I name it, I therefore claim it. So when I want my new Mercedes C-Class, I just have to name it. And the dealer will show it up with my door and say, here it is, Rick, because you called for it and God gave it to you. That's the world telling you a whole lot of crap. And I'm going to tell you, it is crap. The name it, claim it, the pray it, and your wish list will be fulfilled, turns God into a genie. God exists, genies don't. We don't get to tell God how things will turn out. We can petition him, and we should never cease to pray. But never forget, we serve a God. And that God has told us that life will be hard. And sometimes things are going to happen that I'm not going to like. And the Bible tells me I should definitely be praying in those times. And it's okay to have a specific prayer for deliverance, but always add, but if not, to that prayer. Whatever happens on this earth, whatever happens in our lives, is there because God is allowing it. Sometimes, and then oftentimes, especially in a Christian's life, many of the things that happen are unfair. They're cruel. They're harsh. It's not fair. And I do not want to minimize how unjust some things are in life. The taking of a child, an innocent child, seems abhorrent to me. And I cannot and I will not try to give you the why. I can only tell you that the God I serve understands a larger picture than I do. And why will someday be revealed to you and me, but not necessarily on this earth. It requires us to understand another verse that God has given us in his Bible, and it's Romans 8:28. And it essentially says, for all those who follow me, all things in their life will turn out for good. That's a promise from God. Your life sucks. Yep. You're going through a hard time. Yep. And guess what? God will make that be something good. You may take 20 to 30 years before you see it. I remember staring down the barrel of my father's gun, waiting to hear the bang. And for many years after that, I would challenge God with Romans 8:28 and say, I don't see any good that came from that night. Now I'm 65 years old. That's been a long time ago. I was 17. My friends, I can tell you time and time and time again where that night has been testified to about how God delivered me, how God was with me, and how he took that situation and he spoke into lives of other people so that they can see that their suffering is not alone. He took something horrible that I could not and would not understand for many years, and he did truly make something beautiful out of it. In fact, it's so beautiful that if time travel were possible and I could go back and warn myself not to be home that night, I wouldn't do it. Because the good that I've seen come out of that night, from what Jesus has used that for in the time since, has far outweighed the traumatic incident that night was. God has blessed me so richly and blessed others so richly through a horrific situation. Now, I can't say that you will see through your horror and your troubles that, yes, this is where God's going to bless me. And it may take decades. It may take the rest of your life before you can see that. But I tell you this right now. My God tells me, he promises me, and that means he promises you, that all things in your life will be made to good for those who love him. If you're a Christian and life is not fair, fear not, because my God has it. And if his answer is, but if not, I'm okay with that. Because whatever life brings, God will create something out of it that's beautiful, that's healing, that's wonderful. And so, my friends, in your life, as you face unfairness, never forget those words of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. My God can deliver me, but if not, we will not serve your idols. Because those words are powerful. Those are words that a world cannot overcome, and they will not overcome for a person who knows that in their heart. Thank you.